It was a cold, quiet morning when the millionaire stepped out into his garden. The air was crisp, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden glow over the sprawling estate. He liked to take these early walks alone, away from the noise of his busy life. But today, something was different. As he walked past the rose bushes, he noticed a figure curled up on the ground near the fountain. At first, he thought it was a pile of old clothes, but as he got closer, he realized it was a woman. She was dressed in tattered clothes, her face pale and worn. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. The millionaire froze. How had she gotten past the gates? His mansion was surrounded by high walls and security cameras. No one could just wander in. He felt a mix of anger and confusion. Who was she, and what was she doing here? He cleared his throat loudly, hoping to wake her. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, and for a moment, he felt a strange sensation, like she could see right through him. Her eyes were deep and piercing, filled with a sadness that made him uncomfortable. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "How did you get in here?" The woman sat up slowly, wincing as if every movement caused her pain. She didn't seem afraid of him. Instead, she looked at him with a calm, almost knowing expression. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just needed a place to rest." Her voice was gentle, but there was something about it that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she said them, like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "You can't just sleep here," he said, trying to sound firm. "This is private property. I could call the police." She nodded, as if she expected this response. "I understand. But before you do, there's something you need to know." The millionaire frowned. "What are you talking about?" The woman hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "You don't know me, but I know you. And I know what's coming. If you don't listen to me, everything you've built, everything you care about, will be gone." He stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or call for security. She sounded delusional, but there was something in her tone that made him pause. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I'm saying that the future is not what you think. And if you don't change, you'll lose it all." The millionaire felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't know why, but her words struck a chord deep within him. He had always been a practical man, someone who believed in facts and logic. But this woman, this beggar, spoke with a certainty that he couldn't ignore. "Who are you?" he asked again, this time with less anger and more curiosity. She smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting for him to ask. "I'm someone who has seen what you cannot. And I'm here to help you, whether you believe me or not." Before he could respond, she stood up, swaying slightly on her feet. She looked so fragile, like a strong wind could knock her over. But there was a strength in her eyes that contradicted her appearance. "Wait," he said, reaching out instinctively. "Where are you going?" She turned to him, her expression softening. "I'll be here for a little while. If you want to know more, come find me. But be warned, once you know the truth, there's no going back." With that, she walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the garden. The millionaire stood there, staring after her, his mind racing. Who was she? What did she mean about the future? And why did he feel like his life was about to change forever? The millionaire couldn't stop thinking about the beggar. Her words echoed in his mind, haunting him. He tried to dismiss her as a crazy woman, but something about her felt different. She wasn't like the other homeless people he'd seen on the streets. There was a quiet dignity about her, a sense of purpose that he couldn't ignore. The next morning, he went back to the garden, half expecting her to be gone. But she was there, sitting by the fountain, her eyes closed as if in deep thought. She looked even more frail than the day before, but her presence was just as strong. "You came back," she said softly, without opening her eyes. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. I need to know more. Who are you? What did you mean about the future?" She opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze steady. "Sit down," she said, patting the ground beside her. He hesitated again. He wasn't used to sitting on the ground, especially not in his expensive suit. But something about her tone made him obey. He sat down, feeling awkward but curious. "I was like you once," she began, her voice low and calm. "I had everything. Money, power, a life of luxury. But I was blind to the world around me. I thought my wealth made me invincible. I was wrong." The millionaire frowned. "What happened?" She sighed, her eyes distant. "I lost it all. Not just my money, but everything that mattered. My family, my friends, my purpose. I was left with nothing but regret." He felt a pang of sympathy, but he still didn't understand. "I'm sorry, but what does this have to do with me?" She turned to him, her expression serious. "Because you're on the same path I was. You think your wealth protects you, but it doesn't. It blinds you. And if you don't open your eyes, you'll lose everything too." He shook his head, frustrated. "That's not true. I've worked hard for everything I have. I've earned it." "Earned it," she repeated, her voice tinged with sadness. "Or taken it for granted? Do you even know what it's like to struggle? To feel hunger, or cold, or fear?" He didn't answer. Her words hit a nerve, but he wasn't ready to admit it. She reached into the folds of her tattered clothes and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "This is my story," she said, handing it to him. "Read it. Maybe then you'll understand." He took the notebook, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was old and battered, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the first page. The handwriting was neat but faded, as if it had been written years ago. "What is this?" he asked. "Proof," she said simply. "Proof that I'm not lying. Proof that the future is not what you think." He flipped through the pages, his curiosity growing. The notebook was filled with detailed entries, each one describing events that hadn't happened yet: natural disasters, economic collapses, wars. Some of the entries were dated just a few months from now. This can't be real," he muttered, his hands trembling slightly. "It is," she said firmly. "And if you don't believe me, wait and see. But by then, it will be too late." He looked up at her, his mind racing. "How do you know all this? Who are you?" She smiled faintly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and hope. "I'm someone who has seen the future. And I'm here to help you change it." He stared at her, trying to make sense of everything. It sounded impossible, but deep down, he felt a strange sense of truth in her words. He didn't know what to believe, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore her. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She leaned closer, her gaze intense. "Listen to me. Learn from my mistakes. And most importantly, open your heart to the world. Only then can you truly see." He nodded slowly, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the brink of something important. Something life-changing. "I'll try," he said, his voice steady. She smiled again, this time with a hint of relief. "That's all I ask." The millionaire sat in his study, the beggar's notebook open in front of him. He had spent hours reading through the entries, each one more unsettling than the last. The details were too specific, too real to be mere fiction. But how could this woman know about events that hadn't happened yet? It didn't make sense. He looked out the window, his mind racing. The garden was quiet, the morning sun casting long shadows across the lawn. He thought about the beggar's words, her calm but urgent tone. She had warned him about the future, but what could he do to change it? He was just one man, after all. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard a soft knock at the door. He turned, surprised to see the beggar standing there. She looked even more fragile than before, her face pale and drawn. But her eyes were as sharp as ever, filled with a quiet determination. "May I come in?" she asked. He nodded, still unsure of what to say. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The room felt smaller with her presence, as if the weight of her words filled the space. "You've read the notebook," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Yes," he replied. "But I still don't understand. How do you know all this? How can you be sure it's real?" She walked over to the window, staring out at the garden. "Because I've seen it," she said simply. "And if you're willing, I can show you too." He frowned. "Show me? How?" She turned to him, her expression serious. "Close your eyes," she said. "And trust me." He hesitated, unsure of what to do. But something in her voice compelled him to obey. He closed his eyes, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, images began to form in his mind. He saw a city, but it wasn't like any city he had ever seen. The streets were empty, the buildings crumbling. The sky was a dull gray, filled with smoke and ash. It was a world devoid of life, of hope. What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is the future," the beggar replied. "If nothing changes." The scene shifted, and he saw himself. He was older, his face lined with age and regret. He was alone, sitting in a grand but empty mansion. The walls were covered in dust, the furniture broken and worn. He looked hollow, as if all the life had been drained out of him. "This is you," the beggar said. "If you continue on this path." He felt a pang of fear, but before he could respond, the scene changed again. This time, he saw a different world. The streets were bustling with people, their faces filled with joy and hope. The air was clean, the sky a brilliant blue. It was a world full of life, of possibility. "And this," the beggar said, her voice filled with emotion, "is what could be. If you choose to change." He opened his eyes, his heart pounding. The images were gone, but the emotions lingered. He felt a mix of fear, hope, and determination. He looked at the beggar, his mind racing. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled faintly. "It's a gift," she said. "One that I've paid a heavy price for." He shook his head, still trying to process what he had seen. "But what can I do? I'm just one person. How can I change the future?" She stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You're not just one person," she said. "You have the power to inspire others, to make a difference. But it starts with you. It starts with opening your heart to the world." He felt a lump in his throat, her words resonating deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, of responsibility. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to try. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll change. But I need your help." She nodded, her expression softening. "I'll be here," she said. "But the journey won't be easy. Are you ready?" He took a deep breath, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "I'm ready." The millionaire sat in silence, his mind still reeling from the vision the beggar had shown him. The images of the two possible futures, one bleak and desolate, the other vibrant and hopeful, played over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads, and the choices he made now would determine not just his fate, but the fate of countless others. He turned to the beggar, who was sitting quietly beside him. Her presence was calming, but there was an air of mystery about her that he couldn't ignore. He needed answers. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Really? How do you know all this? How can you show me these things?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she sighed, as if accepting that the time had come to reveal the truth. "I told you I was like you once," she began. "But what I didn't tell you is that I'm not from this time. I'm from the future." He stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. "The future? What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that," she said. "I was sent back to this time to warn you, to warn people like you, about what's coming. The future I showed you, the one filled with despair, is real. It's what happens if humanity continues on its current path. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's still time to change." He shook his head, his thoughts spinning. This is impossible. Time travel? The future? It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. She smiled faintly. "I know it's hard to believe. But you've seen the proof. The notebook, the visions, they're all real. I'm not asking you to believe me because of who I am. I'm asking you to believe because of what you've seen." He leaned back, trying to make sense of it all. "If you're from the future, why come to me? Why not go to someone more powerful, someone who can actually make a difference?" "Because it starts with you," she said firmly. "You have influence, resources, and a platform. But more importantly, you have a choice. You can choose to use your wealth and power for good, to inspire others to do the same. Or you can continue on your current path, blind to the consequences." He felt a pang of guilt, her words hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. He had always thought of himself as a self-made man, someone who had earned his success through hard work and determination. But now, he was starting to see the bigger picture, the impact of his choices on the world around him. "What happens if I fail?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I can't change?" She looked at him, her expression softening. "Then the future I showed you will come to pass. But I don't believe that will happen. I've seen the potential in you. I know you can do this." He felt a surge of emotion, fear, hope, and a sense of responsibility all mixed together. He didn't know if he could live up to her expectations, but he knew he had to try. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice steady. She reached into her tattered clothes and pulled out a small, metallic device. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek and futuristic, with a faint glow emanating from its surface. "This is a data crystal," she explained. "It contains information about the future, events, technologies, and strategies that can help you make a difference. Use it wisely. Share it with others who can help. But be careful. Not everyone will understand, and some will try to stop you." He took the device, feeling its weight in his hands. It felt cold and smooth, like a piece of the future itself. He looked at her, his mind racing with questions. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why risk everything to come back and help us?" She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Because I've seen what happens if we don't. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to change it." He nodded, feeling a deep sense of respect for her. She had given up everything, her time, her life, her world, to help people she didn't even know. It was a sacrifice he couldn't fully comprehend, but it inspired him nonetheless. "I'll do my best," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let you down." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "I know you won't." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity for the millionaire. The beggar's words and the visions she had shown him weighed heavily on his mind. He knew he couldn't go back to his old life, not after what he had seen. But changing wasn't easy. Old habits, old beliefs, and old comforts were hard to let go of. He started small. He began by donating a portion of his wealth to charities that focused on environmental conservation and poverty alleviation. It felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable, to give away so much money. But as he saw the impact of his donations, clean water projects in struggling communities, reforestation efforts in devastated areas, he began to feel a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. Next, he turned his attention to his business empire. He had always prioritized profit above all else, but now he started to think differently. He implemented sustainable practices, reducing waste and carbon emissions across his companies. He raised wages for his employees and invested in their well-being. Some of his business partners criticized him, calling his decisions reckless and naive. But he didn't care. He had seen what the future could hold, and he wasn't going to let greed stand in the way of change. The beggar stayed by his side, offering guidance and support. She didn't say much, but her presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. She watched as he struggled to balance his new mission with the demands of his old life, and she was there to encourage him when doubt crept in. One evening, as they sat in the garden, he turned to her. "Do you think I'm making a difference?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. She smiled softly. "Every step counts," she said. "It's not about changing the world overnight. It's about planting seeds. And you're planting more than you realize." Her words gave him comfort, but he still felt the weight of responsibility. He knew he had to do more. He decided to use his influence to inspire others. He started speaking at conferences and events, sharing his story and urging other wealthy individuals to join him in making a difference. At first, many were skeptical. They saw him as a man who had lost his way, someone who had gone soft. But as they listened to his passionate speeches and saw the results of his actions, some began to take notice. One by one, others started to follow his lead. Business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists began to adopt sustainable practices and invest in social causes. It was a slow process, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, the millionaire felt a sense of hope. But not everyone was on board. There were those who resisted change, who saw his efforts as a threat to their way of life. They criticized him publicly, spreading rumors and trying to undermine his credibility. It was a difficult time, and there were moments when he felt like giving up. But every time he thought about the beggar's vision of the future, he found the strength to keep going. One night, after a particularly grueling day, he sat alone in his study, staring at the data crystal she had given him. He hadn't used it yet, afraid of what it might reveal. But now, he felt ready. He activated the device, and a holographic display appeared, showing detailed plans for renewable energy technologies, strategies for global cooperation, and blueprints for sustainable cities. It was a treasure trove of knowledge, a glimpse into what humanity could achieve if it worked together. He spent hours studying the information, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but he also knew he had to start somewhere. He began reaching out to scientists, engineers, and visionaries, sharing the data and working with them to bring these ideas to life. As the weeks turned into months, he started to see the fruits of his labor. His companies became leaders in sustainability, setting an example for others to follow. The projects he funded began to transform communities, providing hope and opportunity to those who had been left behind. And slowly but surely, the world began to change. But the millionaire knew the journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still obstacles to overcome. Yet, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He had found a purpose, a reason to keep going. And through it all, the beggar remained by his side, a silent but steady presence. She didn't need to say much. Her belief in him was enough. The millionaire's efforts were no longer just his own. What had started as a personal mission had grown into a movement. People from all walks of life, business leaders, activists, scientists, and ordinary citizens, were joining him in his quest to create a better future. The ripple effect of his actions was spreading far and wide, touching lives and transforming communities. One of the most significant changes was in the way businesses operated. The millionaire's companies had become models of sustainability, proving that it was possible to be profitable while also being responsible. Other corporations, inspired by his success, began to adopt similar practices. Green technologies, once considered niche and expensive, became mainstream. Renewable energy projects sprang up across the globe, reducing reliance on fossil fuels and slowing the pace of climate change. But it wasn't just about the environment. The millionaire's focus on social responsibility also had a profound impact. His investments in education, healthcare, and poverty alleviation were changing lives. In one community, a school he had funded was providing quality education to children who had never had the opportunity to learn. In another, a hospital he had built was saving lives and improving health outcomes for thousands of people. The millionaire traveled to these communities, meeting the people whose lives had been transformed by his efforts. It was a humbling experience. He had always thought of himself as a self-made man, but now he saw that his success was built on the contributions of countless others. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and a renewed commitment to his mission. One day, while visiting a small village in a developing country, he met a young girl named Amina. She was no more than 10 years old, but her eyes sparkled with intelligence and determination. She told him how the new school in her village had given her the chance to dream of a better future. "I want to be a doctor," she said proudly. "So I can help people, just like you." Her words touched him deeply. He realized that his actions were not just about changing the present, they were about shaping the future. Amina and countless others like her were the ones who would carry the torch forward, building a world that was fairer, kinder, and more sustainable. But the journey was not without its challenges. There were still those who resisted change, who clung to the old ways out of fear or greed. The millionaire faced criticism and opposition from powerful forces who saw his efforts as a threat to their interests. There were times when he felt overwhelmed, when the weight of responsibility seemed too much to bear. During one particularly difficult moment, he turned to the beggar, who had been a constant source of strength and guidance. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he admitted, his voice heavy with doubt. "There's so much resistance. Sometimes it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." She looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion. "Change is never easy," she said. "But every step you take, no matter how small, makes a difference. You've already inspired so many people. Don't underestimate the power of what you've started." Her words gave him the courage to keep going. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had the support of countless others who believed in the same vision. As the movement grew, it began to influence governments and policymakers. Leaders who had once been indifferent to issues like climate change and social inequality were now taking action. International agreements were signed, committing nations to ambitious goals for reducing carbon emissions and promoting sustainable development. The millionaire was invited to speak at global forums, where he shared his story and urged world leaders to prioritize the well-being of people and the planet over short-term profits. His message resonated with many, and he became a symbol of hope and change. But despite his growing influence, he remained humble. He knew that the real heroes were the people on the ground, the teachers, doctors, activists, and volunteers who were working tirelessly to make a difference. He saw himself as just one part of a larger effort, a ripple in a vast ocean of change. As he looked back on how far he had come, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had started this journey for himself, but it had become so much more. It was no longer about him, it was about all of them, working together to create a better world. And through it all, the beggar remained by his side, a silent but steady presence. She didn't need to say much. Her belief in him, and in humanity, was enough. The millionaire's journey had been filled with triumphs and challenges, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Just as the movement he had started was gaining momentum, a crisis emerged that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. It began with a series of coordinated attacks, both physical and digital, on his companies and projects. Factories were vandalized, data servers were hacked, and false rumors were spread to discredit him. The attacks were orchestrated by a powerful coalition of individuals and organizations who felt threatened by the changes he was bringing about. They saw him as a danger to their profits and their way of life, and they were determined to stop him. The millionaire was devastated. He had poured his heart and soul into his mission, and now it seemed like it was all falling apart. He felt a mix of anger, frustration, and helplessness. But deep down, he knew he couldn't give up. Too much was at stake. He called an emergency meeting with his closest allies, business partners, activists, and community leaders who had supported him from the beginning. They gathered in his office, their faces grim but determined. "We're under attack," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "They're trying to destroy everything we've built. But we can't let them win. We have to fight back." The room was silent for a moment as everyone absorbed his words. Then, one by one, they began to speak, offering ideas and strategies to counter the attacks. It was a testament to the strength of the movement he had created, a network of people who were willing to stand together in the face of adversity. But as the meeting progressed, it became clear that the situation was more dire than they had realized. The attacks were not just aimed at his companies, they were also targeting him personally. His reputation was being smeared, his past mistakes exaggerated and twisted to make him look like a hypocrite. The media, influenced by his enemies, began to turn against him. The millionaire felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had always known that change would come at a cost, but he hadn't expected it to be this hard. He began to question himself, wondering if he had made a mistake. Maybe he had been too ambitious, too naive. Maybe he should have stayed in his comfortable life, away from the struggles and sacrifices. One night, as he sat alone in his study, the beggar appeared. She had been quiet lately, letting him navigate the challenges on his own. But now, she could see that he needed her. "You're doubting yourself," she said softly. He looked up, surprised to see her. "How can I not?" he replied, his voice filled with frustration. "Everything is falling apart. I don't know if I can do this anymore." She sat down beside him, her presence calming. "This is the final test," she said. "The moment when you have to decide what matters most to you. Will you let fear and doubt stop you? Or will you keep fighting, no matter how hard it gets?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," she said firmly. "You've already come so far. And you're not alone. There are thousands of people who believe in you, who are counting on you. You can't give up now." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He thought about all the people he had met on his journey, the children in the schools he had built, the workers in the factories he had transformed, the activists who had joined his cause. They were the reason he had started this mission, and they were the reason he had to keep going. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You fight," she said. "Not with anger or revenge, but with courage and determination. You show the world that no matter how hard they try to bring you down, you won't be silenced. You stand up for what you believe in, and you inspire others to do the same." He nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was right. This wasn't just about him, it was about the future of humanity. He couldn't let fear stop him. The next day, he held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as he stepped up to the podium. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding, but his voice was steady. "I know there are people who want to stop us," he began. "They want to silence us, to make us doubt ourselves. But I'm here to tell you that we won't be silenced. We won't back down. Because what we're fighting for is bigger than any one person. It's about the future of our planet, the future of our children, and the future of humanity." The room was silent as he spoke, his words resonating with everyone present. He talked about the progress they had made, the lives they had touched, and the challenges they had overcome. He acknowledged the attacks but refused to be defined by them. "This is not the end," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's just the beginning. And I promise you, we will keep fighting. We will keep working. And together, we will create a better world." As he finished, the room erupted into applause. The reporters, many of whom had been skeptical, were moved by his passion and determination. The press conference was broadcast around the world, and his message inspired millions. The attacks didn't stop overnight, but the tide began to turn. People rallied behind him, standing up to the forces that sought to destroy the movement. It was a long and difficult battle, but the millionaire knew he had made the right choice. And through it all, the beggar remained by his side, a silent but steady presence. She didn't need to say much. Her belief in him, and in humanity, was enough. Years had passed since the millionaire first met the beggar in his garden. The world had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The movement he had started had grown into a global force, inspiring millions to take action for a better future. The bleak vision of the future the beggar had shown him was no longer inevitable. Hope had taken its place. The millionaire stood on the balcony of his home, looking out at the garden where it had all begun. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray, desolate future he had once seen. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and fulfillment, but also a quiet sadness. The beggar was gone. She had disappeared one day, as quietly as she had arrived. There was no farewell, no explanation, just a note left on his desk. It read, "You don't need me anymore. You found your purpose, and the world has found its hope. Remember, the future is not fixed. It is shaped by the choices we make today. Keep fighting, keep believing, and never forget the power of one person to change the world." Her words had stayed with him, a constant reminder of the journey they had shared. He had kept the note, along with the data crystal she had given him, as symbols of the mission they had undertaken together. As he stood there, lost in thought, a young boy approached him. It was his grandson, a bright and curious child who had grown up hearing stories of the beggar and the movement she had inspired. "Grandpa," the boy said, looking up at him with wide eyes, "tell me the story again. The story of the beggar and how you changed the world." The millionaire smiled, his heart swelling with love and pride. He knelt down to the boy's level and began to speak. "It all started one morning, in this very garden," he said. "I met a woman who seemed ordinary but was anything but. She showed me a future that could have been, and she gave me the courage to change it. But it wasn't just me. It was all of us, working together, that made the difference." The boy listened intently, his eyes filled with wonder. "Do you think I can change the world too?" he asked. The millionaire placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice filled with conviction. "You already are," he said. "Every choice you make, every act of kindness, every time you stand up for what's right, you're changing the world. Never doubt the power you have." The boy smiled, his face lighting up with hope. The millionaire felt a surge of emotion, knowing that the lessons he had learned would live on through the next generation. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, the millionaire felt a deep sense of peace. He had come a long way from the man he once was, a man consumed by wealth and ambition. He had found a greater purpose, one that had given his life meaning and left a lasting impact on the world. But he knew the work was never truly done. The future was always in motion, shaped by the choices of each generation. It was up to them to keep the movement alive, to keep fighting for a better world. As he looked out at the horizon, he felt the presence of the beggar, as if she were still by his side. Her voice echoed in his mind, a gentle reminder of the lesson she had taught him: the future is not something we inherit. It's something we create. And with that, he knew he had fulfilled his promise to her. He had changed the world, not just for himself, but for everyone.